I'd been hiking the Pacific Crest Trail for just over 2 weeks. I was alone, which wasn't unusual. Lots of hikers do long stretches solo, but it meant I could go a day or two without seeing another person. That was the appeal for me. Just me, my pack, and miles of forest and mountains. The days were quiet, but it was the nights that always got to me. The woods have a way of making you feel like you're being watched. Every crack of a branch, every echo of a bird call, it sets your nerves on edge when you're out there alone. One evening, just as the sun was dipping low, I got the first real sense that something wasn't right. I'd stopped to filter water at a creek and swore I heard footsteps on the trail behind me. When I looked up, there was no one. I waited, listening, and heard nothing but the rush of the water. That night, I camped off trail, hanging my food and settling in as usual. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of movement. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, just beyond the tree line. Heavy, steady, deliberate steps, not the quick rustle of an animal. I lay there holding my breath, hand on my knife, until the sound faded. By morning, I convinced myself it had to have been a bear or a mountain lion. Out here, that was normal. Over the next 2 days, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. Whenever the wind died down, I thought I heard it. Faint footsteps, always behind me. I'd stop, and the sound would stop too. At one point, while climbing a ridge, I thought I spotted movement through the trees. A dark shape, low and fast. Again, I told myself it had to be an animal. But why did it always feel like it was keeping pace with me? That second night, I camped farther off the trail than usual, almost a quarter mile in. I wanted to disappear into the trees, out of sight. Just before I drifted off, I heard it again. Footsteps, circling this time, slow and careful. My heart pounded in my ears. I waited for the sound of claws, maybe a growl. Instead, I heard nothing, just silence that stretched too long. When I woke in the morning, I noticed something in the dirt near my camp. At first, I thought it was a smudge from my own boots, but when I crouched down, my blood went cold. It was a footprint. A bare human footprint. No tread, no sole, just the impression of toes and a heel. Whoever was following me wasn't another hiker. They weren't even wearing shoes. The sight of that print changed everything. Suddenly, every snapped twig wasn't wildlife. It was him. Every shadow in the trees wasn't my imagination. It was someone watching. The next day, I pushed hard, hiking faster than usual. I stopped less, drank water on the move, and barely took breaks. The entire time, I had the prickling sense of eyes on my back. By late afternoon, the trail dipped into a stretch of old-growth forest. The light there was dim, even though it wasn't near sunset yet. My stomach was tight with dread, but I kept moving, eyes darting to every patch of shadow. That's when I saw him. He was standing about 30 yards off the trail, between the trees. A man, barefoot. His clothes were torn, his face half hidden in the gloom. He wasn't moving. He wasn't carrying a pack. He was just staring at me. I froze mid-step, every instinct screaming to run. But I forced myself to keep walking, my head forward, eyes locked on the path. My hands shook on my trekking poles, but I didn't look back. I hiked until dark before finally stopping, and even then I barely slept. When I closed my eyes, all I could see was his face in the shadows, watching. And the worst part, I never heard him leave. I was traveling across the country for work, long stretches of driving, one small town after another. By the third week, I was sick of hotels. I figured I'd save some money and maybe get something more comfortable, so I started booking Airbnbs along the way. One night, while cutting through a rural part of the state, I found a cheap one-bedroom apartment listing on the app. It was the only thing available nearby, and at half the price of the local motel, it felt like a steal. The pictures showed a cozy little spot in an older brick building, hardwood floors, a couch, a kitchen. Nothing fancy, but it looked clean, safe, and quiet, exactly what I wanted. When I got there, the town was practically silent. Just one gas station, a diner, and a handful of old houses. The apartment matched the photos, though it smelled faintly musty, like no one had stayed there in a while. There was even a welcome basket waiting for me on the table with bottled water and a few snacks. But in the bedroom, I noticed something that hadn't been in the listing. At the far wall was a plain white closet door, and hanging from it was a heavy black padlock. It wasn't unusual for hosts to lock up a storage closet, but something about this one was different. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. The kind of lock you'd use if you really didn't want someone opening that door. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at it, telling myself it was nothing. Still, a locked door in the room I was supposed to sleep in, it planted a seed in the back of my mind. The first night was uneventful until around 2:30 a.m. That's when I woke up, suddenly alert. At first, it was just the silence of being in an unfamiliar place. But then I heard something faint, a soft shuffle, like bare feet across the wooden floorboards. I froze in bed, listening. The sound stopped, then came again, closer this time, right outside the bedroom. Then, clear as day, 3 slow knocks came from the closet door. I held my breath, staring at the padlock. My mind raced for explanations. Pipes, wind, maybe just the old building shifting. But when I pressed my ear closer to the wall, I swore I heard it, breathing, slow, steady on the other side of that door. I barely slept the rest of the night. The second night was worse. Around 3 a.m., I woke to something new, whispering. Not one voice, but 2. They were low, fast, and muffled through the wood. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable, a conversation. I sat frozen in bed, straining to hear. The whispers went quiet. For a few long seconds, the apartment was still. Then came the knock again, 3 times, each one heavier than before. By morning, I felt sick from exhaustion. I tried to distract myself by walking around town, but all day I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake booking this place. When I returned, the welcome basket on the table was in a slightly different position, just nudged a few inches, like someone had moved it. On the 3rd night, I told myself I'd stick it out, check out early in the morning, and get back on the road. But around 1:45 a.m., I woke to the sound of metal scraping. The closet door handle was rattling, slowly at first, then harder, until the padlock clinked against the wood with each shake. I sat frozen in the bed, sheets clutched to my chest. The rattling stopped. Then the wood groaned, bending forward as if someone inside was pressing against it. That was it. I stuffed my bag in seconds, grabbed my keys, and bolted. I didn't even bother turning off the lights. I sat in my car until sunrise, parked across the empty street, too shaken to drive. Every so often I glanced up at the window, half expecting to see someone watching from inside. When I finally messaged the host later that morning, I asked what was in that closet. They replied hours later. Just one sentence. "You weren't supposed to hear that. Don't come back." By the next day, the listing had vanished from Airbnb completely. No trace of it ever being there. But I still think about the moment I closed that bedroom door behind me for the last time. I swear I heard something faint from inside. Laughter. My name is Mark, and this happened when I was still new to urban exploring. There's a building in my city I'll never forget. It had been abandoned for decades, an old office building left to rot when the company went under. People walked past it every day, but no one ever looked twice. The windows were broken, the walls covered in graffiti, and weeds had split the concrete sidewalk out front. Most people wouldn't step foot inside a place like that, but to me, it was a challenge. The kind of place that dares you to see what's inside. I stepped through the shattered glass doors and into the lobby. The first thing that hit me was the smell. A thick, wet mix of mold, rust, and something chemical, like old cleaning supplies that had seeped into the carpet. It clung to the back of my throat and made me swallow hard. The lobby looked like time had just stopped. A few chairs sat overturned, a reception desk buried under piles of ceiling tile, and ferns of moss crawling up through the cracked marble. Every sound I made echoed back at me 10 times louder. I found the stairwell and started climbing. Each floor looked the same at first. Broken furniture, papers turned to mush, graffiti sprayed across the walls. But around the 15th floor, something changed. There was no graffiti, no trash, no empty bottles or burnt-out lighters. The walls were bare, the carpet thick with dust. It was like whoever had been sneaking into the place had stopped at the lower floors and refused to come higher. And as I climbed further, the silence became unbearable. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Every creak of the steps felt like it shook the whole building. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like someone's listening. By the time I reached the upper floors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Down one long hallway, a set of elevator doors had been forced open. The edges of the steel panels were bent outward, scarred with deep gouges from a crowbar. I walked closer, careful not to step too close to the opening. I carefully leaned forward and looked down the shaft, a vertical pit of blackness, stretching down further than my light could reach. I crouched down and felt a rush of air rising out of it, cold and damp, carrying the heavy smell of rust and standing water. I could have stopped there. Any normal person would have, but I didn't. Hanging off the concrete wall inside was a ladder, the steel rungs bolted in a straight line leading into the darkness below. I clipped my flashlight to my jacket, tested the first rung, and began to climb. Every movement echoed. My boots squealed against the ladder, metal clanged under my weight, and the sound bounced up and down the shaft echoing. The rungs were slick with condensation, wet against my gloves. Rust rubbed off in streaks. Halfway down, my light caught the bottom, a shallow pool of stagnant black water glistening like oil. Broken concrete blocks jutted through the surface. The dripping was constant, echoing so loudly I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Then I heard something loud above me. A deep metallic groan echoed down the shaft. It wasn't the building shifting or the wind. It was sharper, heavier, like a cable tightening under strain. My chest went tight. Bits of rust and dust rained down, falling past my head and landing into the water below. I pressed my cheek against the ladder, frozen, and that's when I saw it. Up at the opening, just barely lit by my flashlight beam, a shadow leaned in, a head, a shoulder. The outline of someone peering down at me. They quickly stepped back as if they hadn't wanted me to see them. I gripped the ladder tighter and forced myself to move. My arms and legs shook, but I climbed as steadily as I could back toward the opening. Every step echoed. Every scrape of my boots sounded like it could give me away. When I finally stepped back into the hallway, the silence was overwhelming. My light swept across peeling walls and broken ceiling tiles. Nothing moved. I raised my camera and took a picture of the open shaft before turning toward the stairwell. That's when I noticed something at the far end of the hallway. A person was leaning out from behind a doorway, just enough for me to see the side of their head and shoulder. They weren't moving, just watching me. I called out, but there was no answer. Slowly, they stepped back into the doorway. For a second, I thought they were gone, until an arm stretched back out into the hallway. In their hand was a knife. They didn't step forward. They didn't say anything, just held the knife out where I could see it, gleaming faintly in my light. That was all I needed. I bolted, running for the stairwell and not stopping until I was outside and back on the street. Later that night, when I looked through the pictures on my camera, my stomach turned. In the shot of the elevator shaft, the same person was there, peeking out from the doorway, watching. That was the last time I ever went inside that building. It was just past 2 a.m. when Daniel's eyes began to sting. He'd been behind the wheel nearly 10 hours, hauling an empty flatbed south through California's Central Valley. The world outside had dissolved into a blur of fog, asphalt, and silence. Truckers live in those silences. Sometimes it's comforting, the kind of quiet you can sink into like a blanket. Other times, it's suffocating. Tonight, it was the latter. The GPS screen on his dash had frozen half an hour earlier, locked on a nameless stretch of road, and the cell service had cut out not long after. The only sound left was the hum of the engine and the faint, flickering static of a late-night talk station. Even that was barely coming through. Daniel drummed his fingers against the wheel, fighting fatigue. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, 2 glowing yellow lines pulling him deeper into nowhere. And then, he saw something. At first, it was just a shadow in the mist, a shape on the shoulder of the road. He blinked hard, thinking his tired eyes were playing tricks. But as the truck drew closer, the shape sharpened. It was a girl, standing alone. She wasn't moving. She wasn't waving for help. She just stood there, barefoot, wearing a thin white dress that clung to her like it was damp, her hair plastered against her face. Daniel's chest tightened. Every instinct told him to keep driving. He'd heard the stories. But guilt hit harder than fear. Whoever she was, she looked lost. Small, alone, against everything he'd promised himself about strangers on the road. Daniel slowed the rig and pulled onto the shoulder. She climbed in slowly, without a word, and lowered herself into the passenger seat. Her skin was cold, her hair damp. Daniel could smell it instantly, wet earth, like freshly turned soil. "Rough night out here, huh?" he asked, trying to sound calm. The girl didn't look at him. She just whispered a single word. "Home." Then she gave him an address. Daniel recognized the area, miles off the highway, way out past the farms and orchards, too far for anyone to have walked barefoot in the dark. He offered her his jacket. She pulled it tight around her shoulders but said nothing more. The cab grew colder as the miles slipped past. He tried making small talk, asked if her family was worried, if she wanted to call someone. But her answers never came. She sat stiff, staring at her lap, clutching the jacket as though it were the only thing keeping her there. Once Daniel thought he heard her whisper something under her breath. A name. But when he asked her to repeat it, she said nothing. The fog thickened, swallowing the world outside. The radio drifted into static. The only sound left was the low growl of the engine and the faint rhythm of her breathing beside him. When he finally turned down the gravel road that matched the address, the headlights swept across an old farmhouse set back from the road. The porch light was burned out, the lawn overgrown, the windows completely dark. He slowed, shifted into park, and turned to tell her they'd arrived. But the passenger seat was empty. His jacket lay folded neatly where she'd been sitting, still damp. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Daniel stumbled out of the cab, jacket clutched in his fist, and climbed the porch steps. The boards creaked under his boots. When he knocked, the sound echoed through the house. At first, he thought no one would answer. But then, slowly, the lock turned. The door opened just a crack, revealing the face of an elderly woman. Her eyes widened at the sight of him. He explained what had happened, that he'd picked up a girl, that she'd asked to come here, that she'd been wearing a white dress. The woman's expression shifted from confusion to sorrow. "That was my daughter," she whispered. "But she's been gone 15 years. Her daughter had died in a car accident on the very stretch of highway Daniel had been driving. She had been walking home from a dance when a drunk driver struck her. The dress, the bare feet, everything Daniel had described, matched. Daniel backed away, heart hammering. He returned to his rig, climbed in, and tried to steady his breathing. As he pulled back onto the highway, the radio whispered back to life, nothing but static. The fog pressed heavier against the windshield, and that's when he saw her again, standing by the guardrail, barefoot, the white dress clinging to her in the mist, watching him drive away. Daniel never drove that stretch of highway again. He didn't tell anyone the full story, not the radio static, not the jacket folded in the seat, but he carried it with him for the rest of his life. And if you ever find yourself alone on an empty road in the dead of night and you see a figure waiting in the fog, maybe it's best to keep driving. When Ethan signed the lease, the landlord barely even looked at him. The man just slid a single key across the desk and muttered, "Don't call me for every little thing. The place is old. You'll hear noises." Ethan didn't care. He was 19, fresh out of his parents' house, and desperate for something cheap near campus. The apartment wasn't much, a single bedroom, a cracked bathroom sink, the faint smell of mildew that clung to the walls no matter how much he scrubbed, but it was his. At first, the noises didn't bother him. The scraping in the pipes, the groan of the old radiator, the faint scurrying that came from behind the walls at night. Everyone told him old buildings creak and shift. It was nothing to worry about. But after a few weeks, things began to feel off. A phone charger missing from the outlet, food gone from the fridge, Never a lot, just an apple, a slice of bread, an energy bar he swore he'd left in the cupboard. He laughed it off at first. Maybe he'd eaten it and forgotten. Maybe he'd left it in his backpack. But then came the little things he couldn't laugh off, waking up to the bathroom light still on, his desk chair pulled a few inches away from the desk. The feeling, impossible to shake, that someone had been in the room while he slept, and then he started noticing the vent. It sat near the floor by his bed, a rectangular cover screwed into the wall. At night, when everything else was silent, he swore he could hear something faint. Not air, not pipes, but breathing. Or maybe scratching. Always just soft enough to dismiss, but loud enough to keep him awake. He told himself it was rats. Old buildings were full of them. But one night, lying in bed, he stared at that vent for hours, and he swore. He saw it move. Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore, so he bought a second-hand camcorder from a pawn shop. Nothing fancy, just something that could record through the night. He set it up across the room, pointed directly at the vent and his bed, then forced himself to lie still beneath the covers. For hours, nothing happened. Just the sound of his own breathing, the occasional passing car outside, but sometime after 3 a.m., the apartment fell deathly quiet. The kind of silence where even the hum of the refrigerator seems to hold its breath, and that's when he heard it. A soft metallic creak. He opened his eyes just a fraction, heart hammering. The vent cover was shifting. Slowly, silently, the slats moved outward, and then a hand slipped through. Pale, thin, fingers curling against the carpet. Ethan froze. The cover slid aside, and a man crawled out. Not a burglar, not a neighbor, but someone who looked like he'd been underground for years. His hair hung in greasy strands across his face. His clothes were filthy, his skin stretched tight over bone. The man stood in the middle of the room, just stood there, breathing, watching. Ethan's eyes burned with tears, but he didn't move. He forced himself to breathe slow and steady, pretending to be asleep. The intruder leaned close, inches from his face, long enough for Ethan to hear the shallow rasp of his breath. Then, as quietly as he had come, the man turned, crawled back into the vent, and slid the cover into place. Ethan lay there until morning, paralyzed. The image of that pale hand burned into his mind. When he checked the camcorder, he almost wished it had recorded nothing, but it had caught everything. Ethan went straight to the police. At first, they dismissed it. Maybe a prank, maybe a roommate he hadn't mentioned. But when he showed them the footage, their faces changed. They came back with tools, unscrewed the vent, and pulled it open. Inside was a nest. Old blankets, food wrappers, empty water bottles, and worse, notebooks. Dozens of pages filled with messy handwriting. Notes about Ethan's schedule. What time he came home, when he slept. Even sketches of him lying in bed, drawn in a shaky hand. The man had been living there for weeks. Maybe longer, slipping out when Ethan was gone, standing over him while he slept, watching. The landlord swore no one else had a key. He looked just as shaken as Ethan when they dragged the man out. The police never released much about who he was. No ID, no address, no record. Just a stranger who had carved out a life in the crawl spaces of someone else's home. Ethan moved out immediately, but it didn't matter. Even years later, lying awake in a new apartment across town, he swears he still hears it sometimes. The faint scrape of nails against metal, the rattle of a vent cover shifting in the dark. Tom's gaslight had been on for almost 20 miles. His hands ached from gripping the wheel too tight, and his shoulders burned from the long drive. The road he was on wasn't even one he remembered choosing, just a stretch of cracked asphalt winding through hills and trees. The kind of back road you only find when you take a wrong turn. The clock on the dash ticked past 12:30. The nearest town was still at least half an hour away. His stomach sank as the gauge needle slid lower, lower, kissing empty. He thought he'd be stranded out here. No houses, no cars, no cell signal, just fog and trees pressing closer with every mile. And then, through the haze, a glow. At first he thought he was imagining it. A trick of exhaustion. But as he came around a bend, he saw it clearly. A gas station. Relief poured through him as the neon sign blinked against the dark. But the closer he got, the more that relief soured. The canopy over the pumps leaned to one side. The concrete lot was cracked and uneven. The station looked like it had been forgotten years ago, its faint light the only thing keeping it alive. Still, Tom had no choice. He pulled in, tires crunching over gravel, and let the car roll to a stop beside the nearest pump. That's when he noticed the man. A figure stood just outside the station door. Tall, thin, dressed in a pale shirt and cap. He didn't move, he didn't wave. He just stood there, watching. Tom hesitated before getting out. The pump handle was rusted, stiff as he pulled it free. Gas trickled sluggishly, clicking like it hadn't been used in years. The man by the door hadn't moved, not once. Tom glanced toward him again, but the shadows swallowed his face. "Evening," Tom muttered, raising a hand in greeting. No reply. The air felt heavier now, damp with mist. When the pump finally stopped, Tom slid the nozzle back into place and walked toward the door. A faint bell rang as he pushed it open. The smell hit him first, mildew and dust, thick enough to choke on. The shelves were bare, sticky with grime, cans and wrappers long expired. The register sat dark, its buttons broken. Receipts yellowed with age were scattered across the counter. "Hello?" Tom called. His voice echoed strangely. No answer. He took a step further inside. A refrigerator hummed faintly at the back of the room, its glass so fogged he couldn't see what was inside. Only a faint glow pulsed behind the frost, like a red bulb trying to burn through. The overhead light flickered violently, buzzing so loud it made his teeth ache. Through the front window, Tom glanced back at the lot. The man was gone. His heart skipped. He turned a slow circle, the silence pressing tighter. "Hello?" He tried again, louder this time. Nothing. The bell above the door jingled faintly, but no one had touched it. Tom's stomach knotted. He backed toward the door, his shoes sticking slightly against the dirty tiles. When he stepped outside, the lot was empty. The canopy groaned in the wind, and yet he felt watched. Tom climbed into his car, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine coughed, then roared to life. He gripped the wheel, forcing himself not to look around. The neon sign flickered once, then went dark. He pressed the gas and pulled out, headlights cutting the mist as the road swallowed him again. His eyes flicked constantly to the mirrors. For a long stretch, all he saw was fog. Then, movement. A figure. The man, standing at the edge of the highway, pale against the mist. Watching him drive away, Tom didn't breathe until he saw the lights of a small town miles later. He pulled into the first diner he saw, hands trembling as he ordered coffee just to feel something normal. When the waitress asked where he was coming from, he mentioned the gas station off Highway 19. Her face fell. "There hasn't been a station out there in years," she said. "It burned down back in the 90s. They tore the rest down not long after." Tom stared at her, the words catching in his throat. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her about the man, or the neon glow, or the way the fridge had hummed in the silence. He just drank his coffee, eyes on the door, praying it wouldn't swing open. Tom never drove that road again, but sometimes, on long, empty stretches of highway, he swears he sees a faint red glow in the distance, a station that shouldn't exist, and if he ever stopped again, he wasn't sure he'd make it back on the road. I worked the night shift at the hospital, and I'll never forget what happened on this night. The hospital feels different after midnight. The air grows heavier, colder, like the building itself is holding its breath. The hallways stretch out forever, and the buzzing lights overhead flicker just enough to make you think someone walked past when no one did. Empty wheelchairs line the walls like they're waiting to be used. Around 2 a.m., I got a new patient, a woman in her late 20s, pale and shaking, complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath. She looked exhausted, like the act of standing was too much. I did what I always did. Took her vitals, pulse, blood pressure, oxygen, logged them neatly in the chart, printed a wristband and slid it around her wrist. Her skin felt cold, not clammy, not feverish, just cold, the way tile feels cold under your feet. She gave me a faint smile when I wheeled her into a private room halfway down the ward. "Thank you," she whispered. I set the monitor to track her, clipped the leads in place, then left her to rest. I noted the time. Everything felt routine. But an hour later, when I came back with her medication, the bed was empty. The sheets were neatly smoothed, the way housekeeping would leave them. The monitor still on, wires dangling loose, beeping faintly into the silence. The patient was gone. I paged security, and they searched the entire floor. Every hallway, every stairwell, every exit. No one had seen her leave. No alarms had gone off. I went back to the chart on the bed. My handwriting was right there. Pulse, blood pressure, oxygen, all logged clear as day. But when I reached into my pocket, I froze. The wristband, the one I could swear I had already fastened around her wrist, was still in my pocket. I pulled it out, staring at it like maybe it wasn't real. But it was. I remembered the feeling of it snapping into place, the way her hand brushed mine. I remembered everything, but here it was, unused, like none of it had ever happened. My heart was racing as I replayed the admission in my head. Every detail, the look on her face, the way her voice cracked when she thanked me, the coldness of her skin. I knew it was real. And yet, she was gone. When the sun came up, I brought the chart to my supervisor. She looked at the name, and her face went pale. That name had been in our records before. A woman in her 20s, same symptoms, chest pain, shortness of breath. Same wing, same room. She had died there years earlier. Some people told me I was overtired, that I'd imagined it all. But I don't believe that. I can still see her lying in the bed, thanking me in that soft voice. I can still feel her skin when I placed the wristband on her. And I'll never forget the cold weight in my stomach when I reached into my pocket and found it still there. The nurses still whisper about it. They say sometimes, if you walk past that room in the quietest hours of the night, you'll see her again, sitting on the bed, waiting to be admitted. I'll never forget that night. I took a leave of absence until I was ready to return to work. When I returned, I switched wings and asked for a morning shift. I learned that night that hospitals keep records of every patient who comes and goes, but not everyone decides to leave. Being a security guard at a hospital wasn't too bad. Most nights were calm, but felt like the shift would never end. This night was different. The shift had started like any other. I checked the parking lot, the emergency room entrance, and then made my way through the East Wing, my least favorite part of the hospital. Most of it had been shut down for renovations. The paint peeled from the walls, the floors were scuffed and dull, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in a way that made the silence even worse. Walking those halls at 2 a.m. felt like walking through a place that had been abandoned for years. Every sound echoed too loud. My boots, the squeak of my radio, even the rattle of an air vent down the corridor. I knew the East Wing was empty. It always was. But that night, as I walked past the numbered doors, something stopped me cold. Room 6. The door was cracked open. A faint glow spilled out across the hallway floor. That couldn't be right. Every door in that wing was supposed to be locked and dark. My logbook even confirmed it. Rooms 1 through 12, all unoccupied. And yet, I heard it. The steady beep of a heart monitor. I froze, my hand tightening on my flashlight. I pushed the door open with my shoulder and stepped inside. The bed was made, but the sheets were turned down like someone had been lying there minutes ago. The heart monitor glowed faint green, showing a steady pulse, but the bed was empty. I walked slowly around the room, every muscle tight, waiting for someone to pop out from the shadows. Nothing, just silence and the faint hum of the monitor. I grabbed my radio. "Dispatch, do we have anyone in room 6, East Wing?" Only static answered me. The air grew colder. I could see my breath, white mist curling in the glow of the monitor. Then, without warning, the beeping quickened. The green line on the monitor twitched erratically, faster and faster, before it suddenly flatlined. A piercing tone filled the room, long, unbroken, deafening. And then I heard it. Breathing, slow, heavy, directly behind me. I turned, sweeping my flashlight across the room. The beam caught on the window glass, and for a split second, I saw it. A tall, hunched shadow standing in the corner. But when the light steadied, the shadow was gone. The monitor clicked silent. The room was dark again. I backed into the hallway, my hands shaking, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. My radio hissed useless static. I forced myself to walk away, every step heavy. I told myself not to look back and to just finish the round and get out. But halfway down the hall, I stopped. Something inside me needed to check one more time, needed to prove the room was empty. I turned, slowly, and looked back at room 6. Through the narrow glass window, the bed was no longer empty. A dark shadow figure was laying in the bed, pitch black and thin, chest rising in shallow breaths. Its head shifted toward me, revealing dark, hollow eyes that seemed to look into my soul. I blinked, and the bed was empty again, sheets smooth, monitor silent. That was enough. I didn't step closer. I didn't try to explain it. I just got out of there as fast as I could. When morning came, I told one of the older guards. He just gave me a grim look and said, "Yeah, some people say he still checks in from time to time." I didn't know what to say, but now, when I patrol the East Wing, I walk faster past room 6, and I never ever look back at the window. I worked at a hospital in Mexico City, and I'll never forget what happened the night I took the elevator alone. It was around 3 in the morning, the dead hours, when most of the patients are asleep and the halls are too quiet. I had just finished checking on a patient in the ICU and needed to head down to the pharmacy. Most people hate using elevators at night in hospitals. They creak, they shudder, they groan like old bones. You always feel like the doors might open on something you weren't expecting. I stepped in, pressed the button for the ground floor, and leaned back against the rail, exhausted. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, flickering just enough to make the corners of the elevator feel darker than they should have been. The doors slid shut and the car lurched downward. But it didn't stop at the ground floor. The numbers on the display just kept ticking down to basement levels. I pressed the lobby button a few more times, hoping it would stop and go back up, but it just kept going. The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors shuddered open, and I stepped out into a hallway I had never seen before. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of mold and rust. The walls were concrete, cracked and water-stained, lined with old gurneys and carts that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. A single fluorescent tube flickered above me, buzzing loud enough to make my ears ring. I should have gone back inside. I should have pressed any button and gotten out of there. But I didn't. I took a few steps forward, my shoes sticking slightly against the wet tiles. It was colder down there, the kind of cold that gets into your lungs. At the end of the hallway was a door. It stood half open, shadows spilling out from the darkness beyond. I told myself maybe I had stepped out on a service level I didn't know existed. Maybe the hospital had storage down here. But then I noticed the stains. Dark smears dragged along the walls at waist height, handprints, and from behind the half-open door came the sound of crying, software distant, like someone was weeping into their hands. My chest tightened. I called out to see if someone was there. The crying stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against me, thick and suffocating, like the walls themselves were listening. That was when the lights flickered hard, and for a split second, I thought I saw shapes moving further down the hall. Not patients, not staff. Shapes too tall, too thin, pressed against the walls like shadows trying to peel themselves free. I stumbled backward into the elevator, my pulse hammering in my throat. I slammed the lobby button, praying the doors would close. The crying started again, closer this time, echoing from everywhere at once. The shadows at the end of the hall stretched longer, bending toward me. The half-open door creaked wider, and in the darkness behind it, I saw the faint outline of a morgue drawer pulled halfway open. The elevator doors screeched as they slid shut. For one horrible moment, they caught on something, like invisible hands were holding them apart, and then they closed with a slam. The car jolted upward, the numbers blinking as the elevator ascended. When the doors opened, I was back in the hospital lobby, bright fluorescent lights spilling in, normal as ever. Everything looked ordinary, clean. I stumbled out, trying to steady my breathing. The security guard at the desk gave me a strange look, asked if I was okay. I told him I must have hit the wrong button and ended up in a basement. He looked at me confused. "This hospital doesn't have a basement," he said. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him what I'd seen or what I'd heard. But I never took that elevator again. And sometimes, when I walk past it at night, I swear I still hear the faint echo of crying, coming from deep below the floors, where no one should be.